Today's What in the World update comes to us from Nigeria and concerns the story of a 15-year-old boy who did horrific things to a 14-year-old girl. I'm not going to go into the details of what that is. I'm sure you can imagine already. And I guess a debate or conversation has erupted because many people would like to see him sentenced to death for his crimes. And the girl made this tweet you can see on the screen talking about how she doesn't believe that people of this age should be sentenced to death. And I actually agree with her. But it struck me that a lot of people like, commenting on the tweet, interacting with it, they were very shocked at what her position, and they were actually wishing bad things on her because they feel like it should be obvious that someone like this should be put to death. So it got me thinking about my position, why I believe that I don't believe in the death penalty more generally, but definitely not when it comes to children. So I'd like to get into why I think we shouldn't be putting children to death. I would think that would be obvious to most people, but to be fair, some people might have different positions based on the heinousness of the crime. So let's get into it. So I think I don't believe in the death penalty for a few reasons. And I think one of the reasons is because of the actual barbarity of taking a life. A lot of people, soldiers, mostly soldiers, that have actually consciously took the life of other people, have talked about the mental trauma involved and the fact that even if you believe that the other person is the worst of the worst as they do in war, when you actually come to doing that, the the gravity of what you're about to do hits you very, very strongly. And so it's such almost a spiritual thing. Even if you don't believe in God, there's a seriousness to it that I think we shouldn't decide as a society to consciously do that to someone else, no matter what they've done. So if someone's committed a crime that we feel is particularly heinous or disturbing, we're observing that because we're saying we're better than this. We wouldn't behave in that way. But us now killing them, a lot of times those crimes would be something to do with, sexual and involving some kind of murder as well. Us now saying this crime is so heinous that we're in turn going to do what you've done to someone back to you. It doesn't seem like we actually there's any justice in this situation because we're condemning someone, then in the same act condemning them by doing what they've done to someone else, and this is somehow meant to restore a kind of you know justice and equity in the situation. It doesn't seem logical from that point of view, from my perspective. Bringing it back to the situation at hand, now I mentioned earlier the alleged perpetrator in this case was a 15-year-old boy. Um, the conversation around whether or not he should be sentenced to death. Obviously, I already mentioned the fact that I don't believe in the death penalty, but also when it comes to children, and I think we get this for many types of emotive crimes, right? Crimes that really shock our conscience. It's always very natural for us to want the most extreme punishment because that's what the emotional reaction is. But I think if you reflect on the fact that as a child, ultimately the responsibility for a child rests with the parents. If this child did something in school, they would call the parents. If they were arrested for any kind of menial offense, shoplifting, jaywalking, anything like that, the first people you'd call are the parents. So there should also be, in this case, a shared responsibility. Obviously, that doesn't mean you can't put the parents to death for what their child did, but there should be a shared responsibility to understand that this child is still a child, and therefore there are parents that are responsible for them that we have to ask questions of as to how the child has come to commit this heinous crime. Now, the removal of some of that responsibility, which society already agrees with, you can't then pick and choose when someone is a child and when one isn't. And I think that's the biggest issue with this. Deciding to sentence someone to death because of the heinousness of their crime when they're a child essentially means you're removing and picking and choosing whether or not this person is a child or this person is not a child for which specific crime they've committed. And you can't really do that. Children are children in all their forms, can't divorce the fact that they're children simply because they've done something that's so heinous or out of the ordinary. And I think following on from that, we know that children are very much influenced by what goes on in their surroundings, in their society, mainly at home as well. So if we start to learn more about this case and we find out that, maybe the father of this child, we're not saying this is the case, but the father of this child is an abuser and the child has been severely abused physically, emotionally, in other ways that we don't want to talk about because we don't want to get banned from, platforms. If we find that out, the people that are currently advocating for him to die will probably start to see it differently. They might still believe that, but they'll start to say, okay, maybe, there are other people that are responsible for this. And that's precisely the point. The fact that there can be information that comes out that allows you to change your position suggests that, again, those positions are not grounded in principles. And when it comes to many situations, and I mentioned free speech in my previous video, principles are very important. And when it comes to the principle that children are children, you can't pick and choose when that applies. If you're picking and choosing when your principles applies, they're not principles, they're hobbies. And so if you're watching this video and you believe that principles, as a principle, you believe that people under 18 are children, doesn't mean you don't hold them responsible for their actions, because even as children, your parents hold you responsible for your actions. But if you believe people under 18 are children, then that means you believe that the primary responsibility for them and their actions lie with them, but also lie with their parents. And so it doesn't make sense for you to sentence a child to death because, if someone asked you in an abstract sense, would you kill a child, or would you sentence a child to death for a crime? You probably reflectively say no. If they now start to mention to you what kind of crimes they are, you might start to change your mind. But again, the principles should be consistent regardless of the case it's in. So the principle of free speech, like I mentioned in my previous video, the time that that principle is most important is when it's most difficult to apply. So if you have a principle, for example, that children are children, the time that it's most difficult to apply in cases like this is exactly when you should be thinking about applying them. If your principles can't be applied when it's most difficult, then it's not a principle. It's just a thing you have an interest in, and you may or may not abandon whether or not the situation suits or doesn't suit you. And that's why we have the justice system we have. We don't reserve the right to a free trial for people that have committed crimes that we find acceptable. In this country, for example, we don't have the death penalty. We don't say because this crime is so heinous, we're going to make a special exception and have the death penalty for that reason. We abolish death penalty because of principles. There are many reasons, because sometimes you can have false convictions, things like that, but mainly because, as a principle, we don't want the state to be in the business of killing people. If you believe in the principle, children are children, or you don't believe in the death penalty, or you believe in abolition, the time that principle will be most tested is not when you hear about someone shoplifting because their children are hungry at home and they can't feed them. It's very easy to apply the principle there. The time that's the hardest to apply that principle will be a situation like this, where it looks like this person's done a crime so heinous. You're hearing things like they can't be rehabilitated. There's no forgiveness for this. There's no coming back from this. They just have to die. Let's just kill them now. That's when you have to stick most fervently in your principles, because that's what principles are. They're meant to be applied universally. And so, just to conclude, because I believe in the principle that children are children, I'm always going to apply that principle regardless of the situation. And because I'm applying that principle in this situation, I have to come to the conclusion that a child doesn't deserve to be sentenced to death. And so, therefore, I don't agree that this person should be sentenced to death. Obviously, this is Nigeria, so who's to say what kind of justice system is going to be applied to this person? Clearly, in our country, if you don't know about that, the justice system is liberally applied depending on who you are, how much money you have, the kind of influence you have. And again, this might be an argument for why you wouldn't want them to apply something like the death penalty, because obviously in this case, there might be a lot of evidence that suggests this person did it. But in other cases, we've definitely had cases where, crimes can be conjured up against someone and they can be executed and sentenced to death before, they're able to actually seek legal redress and have, represent themselves. A lot of people in Nigeria right now, many people always make the point that don't let Nigeria happen to you. What does that mean? That means that you could be sitting somewhere minding your business and the police come and arrest you and just parade you in front of the public, accusing you of killing 5 women. You might not have a lawyer, you might just be in prison, they might just not give you a court date, you sit there for 2-3 years. If they kill that kind of person before they get a chance to actually present their defense in a court of law, amongst with a jury of their peers. We actually don't have the jury system in Nigeria, funny enough, but that's another topic for another day. They wouldn't get the chance to actually prove their innocence. Now, in this case, I'm not saying that this child is innocent. I haven't actually seen the facts of the case. It appears like they're guilty. But the principle here is that children are children. And if children are children, we can't be in the business of killing kids. On that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll speak to you guys in the next What in the World update.